Hey everyone, welcome back to Why Buildings Matter. In today's episode, we're diving into a fascinating topic in the world of architecture: formalism versus anti-formalism. This is one of the most important debates in the philosophy of art and has had a profound influence on how we evaluate and experience architecture. Have you ever stood in front of a building and wondered, what makes it compelling? Is it its shape, its colors, or is it its connection to history? Some people believe that the essence of architecture lies in geometry, proportions, and composition. This is the formalism perspective. On the other hand, others argue that architecture cannot be separated from cultural, historical, or functional context. This is the anti-formalism point of view. So how do these two perspectives differ? Let's explore together. Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and welcome to Why Buildings Matter, a shortcast series brought to you by the Architecture Hypothesis podcast. This series is designed to be short and digestible, something you can listen to during your free time, at the end of the day, on a train, a bus, or whenever you feel like diving into thought-provoking discussions about architecture. Each episode will explore a key architectural concept and discuss a fascinating book on architectural theory or criticism. So, let's get started. Before we go any further, we need to understand what formalism actually is. Formalism is the idea that a building's aesthetic value comes primarily from its formal properties, things like shape, proportions, colors, and textures. According to this perspective, a building can be evaluated aesthetically without considering its function, historical background, or social context. A great example of this is the glass pyramid at the Louvre, designed by Eo Ming-pei. When you look at this structure, you might be struck by its pure geometric beauty, but at the same time, if you're familiar with history, you might also recognize its reference to the pyramids of Giza or its stark contrast to the historic buildings surrounding it. And that raises an important question. Can we judge the value of a building based only on its form, or do other factors play a role? The truth is, formalism in architecture isn't just one single approach. It has many variations. Some architects believe that a building's form is closely linked to its materials and structural properties. Others argue that form follows abstract design principles, like proportion rules and mathematical harmony. Another perspective suggests that certain parts of a building can be judged purely by form, while other parts must be understood within a broader cultural and historical context. In many cases, formalism isn't just a way of analyzing architecture. It's also a design philosophy. Some architects believe that when designing a building, form, shape, proportion, color should come first and foremost. That's why supporters of formalism argue that architecture should be judged based on visual elements rather than function or historical background. But can we completely ignore function and narrative when evaluating architecture? That's the very question that the anti-formalists challenge. Anti-formalism, sometimes called contextualism, doesn't dismiss the value of form, but it argues that to truly understand a building, we need to look beyond just aesthetics. A great example of this is the University of Virginia, designed by Thomas Jefferson. This campus embodies a neoclassical architectural style with grand columns and domes that exude elegance. But what makes this university special? It's not just about the architectural form, it's about what it represents. This university symbolizes the Enlightenment, democracy, and the ideals of education in America. That's why anti-formalists argue that evaluating a building purely on its form is insufficient. We also need to consider historical, cultural, and functional aspects. One of the key branches of anti-formalism is the idea of functional beauty. This perspective suggests that a structure is beautiful if its form is well suited to its function. This isn't a new concept. As early as the 18th century, philosophers like George Berkeley and David Hume argued that beauty comes from how well an object fulfills its intended purpose. Later, Immanuel Kant suggested that architecture is unique among the arts because it must always serve a practical function. Think about it. A church isn't just visually impressive because of its Gothic arches. It's beautiful because it creates a sacred, awe-inspiring atmosphere. But here's a tricky question. What happens when a building loses its function? For example, consider ancient Roman ruins, old temples and amphitheaters that no longer serve their original purpose. Yet, they still captivate us. If beauty comes from function, why do we find these ruins beautiful? Some scholars try to explain this by saying that ruins have a unique kind of non-functional beauty, but this weakens the original argument of functional beauty. So, does function alone define a building's beauty, or is there something more? Some scholars argue that architecture's aesthetic value isn't just about form or function. It also depends on emotion, symbolism, and philosophy. Think about iconic landmarks like Notre Dame Cathedral or the Arc de Triomphe. These structures aren't just functional. They carry deep historical and cultural significance. For example, when you enter a Gothic cathedral, the soaring ceilings and stained glass windows evoke a sense of spiritual transcendence. This experience goes beyond pure function. And what about modern architecture? Some works by architects like Bernard Tschumi or Zaha Hadid don't necessarily have a clear functional purpose, yet they're still considered important architectural works. Maybe then, a building's value is a complex combination of form, function, cultural meaning, and personal experience. To conclude this episode, let me introduce you to a fascinating book by Susan Sontag on the nature of art and interpretation. Susan Sontag is arguably one of the most brilliant and provocative critics of the 20th century. If Roland Barthes declared the death of the author in La Mort de l'auteur, Sontag, in Against Interpretation, went even further. She questioned the entire process of interpreting art. She rejected the notion that a work of art exists primarily to convey a deep meaning, arguing instead that art should be experienced directly in its purest form. This perspective challenges a centuries-old tradition in Western aesthetics, where critics and scholars constantly try to decode, dissect, and analyze works of art in search of hidden messages. But Sontag asks, what if we are suffocating art by overanalyzing it? In Against Interpretation, she writes, "We need an erotics of art rather than a hermeneutics of art." In other words, she calls for an immediate sensory engagement with art rather than an intellectualized, analytical approach. This idea is particularly relevant to architecture. Think about how modern urban planning sometimes distorts architecture, prioritizing function over experience. That just as cities can be ruined by rigid, inhuman zoning laws, art can be reduced to an intellectual puzzle when we insist on interpreting it too much. She gives examples from film, literature, and visual art, criticizing how critics often impose theoretical frameworks like Freud's psychoanalysis or Marxist ideology onto works that were never meant to be read that way. She argues that this process strips the aesthetic essence of art and replaces it with a heavy layer of intellectual baggage. This brings us back to architecture. Is architecture being overinterpreted today? Let's take contemporary architecture. When we look at a building by Rem Koolhaas or Tadao Ando, do we truly experience its spatial poetry, or are we too busy analyzing its symbolic meaning? Consider Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and the modernist movement. Their work was a reaction against excessive ornamentation, seeking to strip architecture down to its purest form. In a way, this aligns with Sontag's argument. Perhaps architecture should be felt, not endlessly interpreted. Think about Mies van der Rohe's famous phrase, "less is more." Could this be a philosophical counterpart to Sontag's call for an erotics of art instead of overinterpretation? Or take Valerio Olgiati's concept of non-referential architecture. The idea that a building does not need external cultural references to have meaning. Just as Sontag rejects the overinterpretation of art, Olgiati suggests that a building should speak for itself without needing a symbolic or historical justification. Of course, not everyone agrees with Sontag. Some critics argue that her position is paradoxical. If art should not be overanalyzed, then what about against interpretation itself? Isn't Sontag engaging in the very act of analysis she criticizes? Even more ironically, while she rejects the idea that art should be interpreted, her own book, On Photography, 1977, is one of the most profound interpretations of photography ever written. This contradiction makes Sontag's work both fascinating and frustrating. She challenges our assumptions about art, yet she herself is deeply engaged in interpretation. Despite the contradictions, Sontag's work is more relevant than ever. We live in a time of constant analysis and information overload. Everything, art, movies, architecture, is endlessly dissected, reviewed, and theorized. But Sontag's perspective reminds us, what if we just experience art without trying to extract a message from it? What if we look at a building not as a symbol or a theory, but simply as a space that makes us feel something? This is a profound challenge, both for art and for architecture. Have we lost the ability to experience buildings as they are? Or are we drowning in layers of interpretation? Sontag may not have all the answers, but she dares us to ask the question. And perhaps sometimes the best way to understand architecture is simply to stand in a space and feel it without trying to explain why. That wraps up today's episode. Let's keep this discussion going. What do you think? Do we overanalyze architecture, or does meaning always matter? This has been Why Buildings Matter. Until next time, stay curious. If you enjoyed today's episode of Why Buildings Matter, consider supporting us by buying a coffee. Links to Ko-fi and PayPal are in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any upcoming episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode of Why Buildings Matter.